good afternoon, brethren. I want to welcome and thank everyone for tuning in and joining us from the various locations from around the world for the broadcast of today's Sabbath message. Today's message will be delivered by David J. Smith, and it is titled, Proving World Government is Planned. This is message number 1155. David J. first delivered this message sometime in October 2003. And I'm your host today, Tim West. Well, as you may know, last week we were experiencing some more difficulties with our technical issues. This week I've been having some severe issues with my internet connection staying up. So we'll get straight into David's message and see how far we get. If we're still up after David J's message, I'll be talking about the mark of the beast. So let's get right into today's message. Grab something to sip on, some lunch, or your favorite snack. Find a comfortable place to relax and enjoy today's message.
Newswatch Magazine presents the analysis of world news in the light of Bible prophecy with David J. Smith.
In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21, it says, "Prove all things and hold fast to that which is good." Then in Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, and then verse 8 through 10, it says, "But you, O Daniel, shut up the words, seal the books, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." Then notice what he said in verse 8 to 10. "And I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall the end of these things be?" And he said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed to the time of the end. Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand." Brethren, there are things that are going on in the world today which many of us do not comprehend because they are behind the scenes and done in secret. But the book of Revelation chapter 13 does reveal there is coming a one-world government. And it even says in verse 7 that it's going to bear rule over every nation, every tribe, every tongue, every language. That means the totality of the world. And so is this system rising because we saw the trends when many will be running to and fro, knowledge will be increased, then suddenly the books would be open to our understanding. There was a newspaper article from Great Britain. It was published in This is London. And the head of it was concentration camps for Londoners. I'll just read a sentence or two. "Plans have been drawn up by the government for a mass evacuation of London in the event of a terrorist attack. It's been reported. Leaked documents detain how residents could be herded into rest and reception areas in the home counties." End of quote. Then there was another article in a publication in England, SMH publication. It was entitled, "London Could Be Evacuated If Attacked." It said in a couple of sentences, the Blair government reportedly has secret plans to evacuate London and other big cities in the event of a terrorist strike or threat. They include herding Londoners into rest and reception areas in the country and raise the possibility of rehousing the dislocated for the medium or long term if an attack renders an area uninhabitable. Then there was a Los Angeles Times news article. It was entitled, "Camps for Citizens, Ashcroft's Hellish Vision." Here's what it said. Attorney General John Ashcroft's announced desire for camps for United States citizens he deems to be enemy combatants has moved him from merely being a political embarrassment to being a constitutional menace. End of quote. Then there was an article in the Village Voice of New York, headline, General Ashcroft's detention camps. Quote, under the Justice Department's new definition of enemy combatant, which won the enthusiastic approval of the President and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, anyone defined as an enemy combatant, very much including American citizens, can be held indefinitely by the government without charges. A hearing or a lawyer, in short, incommunicado. End of quote. So all their constitutional rights, anyone who is charged as an enemy combatant. This is modern America right now. Then there was on the Newsmax internet a title, FEMA preparing for mass destruction attacks on citizens, on cities. FEMA, the federal agency charged with disaster preparedness, is engaged in a crash effort to prepare for multiple mass destruction attacks on U.S. citizens, including the creation of sprawling temporary cities to handle millions of displaced persons. End of quote. Then there was another article entitled, FEMA's Plan for Mass Destruction Attacks. Of course it's true. The article, the author of it said, let me state for the record that FEMA is moving ahead with plans to create temporary cities that would handle millions of Americans after mass destruction attacks on U.S. cities. Then once again, the London, England paper, SMH. Here are the headlines. Foundations are in place for martial law in the United States. Quoting, recent pronouncements from the Bush administration and national security initiatives put in place in the Reagan administration could see internment camps and martial law in the United States. These are serious things that are being written about on the major newspapers, internet sources all over the world, not just in America, but even in England. Then the Miami Herald, a very prestigious newspaper in the United States, headlined, Rights Panelist Foresees Internment Push. Quoting, a member of the United States Civil Rights Commission said Friday that he could foresee a scenario in which the public would demand internment camps for Arab Americans if Arab terrorists strike again in this country. But as I'll show in a moment, it's not just for Arabs. It's anyone that they declare as an enemy combatant to silence any opposition to their coup d'etat that they are planning. Then the Detroit Free Press, which has been publishing since 1900, had this vast quarantine role advocated for states. Quote, in the event of a bioterrorist attack using a deadly and contagious disease such as smallpox, public health officials want to be able to close roads and airports, high schools, and highways and herd people into stadiums. End of quote. And then on a radio program, KXLY, they made this statement as they read from a newspaper article, concentration camps in Okanagan County. Okanagan County Commissioner Dave Schultz says he's convinced his county is a designated home for a concentration camp in case of civil unrest. End of quote. These headlines are very, very revealing as to what is going on in the United States of America in secret. And just a few blips here and there are telling us what is foretold in the Bible, even though it is not expressed in the biblical terms, but it corresponds to what the Bible says. There is a huge, huge headline in the Fort Smith, Arkansas newspaper, Thursday, August 19th, 2003, entitled, Is Constitution in Good Hands with President? And he's meaning President George W. Bush. I'll summarize some of the statements here. The writer of this article happens to be one of the foremost authorities on the First Amendment to the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He said that there's been press conferences where Tony Blair of England and President Bush of the United States are trying to explain why they use certain items to declare war on Iraq, which has now been proven false. And they're trying to still hold that they're true. As a direct result, many people are being held in Guantanamo Bay down in Cuba. And President Bush said, "The only thing I know for certain is that these people are bad people." Now you have to understand, this is the President of the United States prejudging someone as being guilty before they've ever had a lawyer, a trial, or anything that the Constitution of the United States holds as sacred to protect people from government. Mr. Nate Hentoff, who wrote this particular article, said that it's not surprising that the President discarded the presumption of innocence. In other words, he's already declared them guilty, whether they are or not. Nobody knows till the facts comes out. He said, after all, he alone on his authority has already designated these two American citizens as enemy combatants, sending them to the military brigs on American soil indefinitely, without charges, without access to a lawyer, or to anyone except the prison guards. This is the new Patriot Act for America that you and I have not been told about, but this is the way it's being used right now, and this fulfills Bible prophecy. There must be a way where they're going to take the United States of America. In this article, he goes on to say that there was testimony before the House Judiciary Committee by Attorney General John Ashcroft, in which Mr. Ashcroft just all but stated that Americans could disappear off the streets of America as an enemy combatant, and none of their relatives would even know what happened to them. They were not entitled to a lawyer, habeas corpus, or anything else. They would rot away until the government decided what to do with them. He went on down in this particular article as a First Amendment specialist and the Bill of Rights specialist. And he said that it is not surprising that John Ashcroft, Attorney General, sees no constitutional problem with the Patriot Act. He says that the Patriot Act was proposed to do away with the habeas corpus. That means that it would be suspended. And these people who are picked up off the street as potential enemy combatants, whether it's American citizen, Arab, Chinese, it doesn't matter who it is, they would not be brought forth for a speedy trial. And this is one of the greatest things the Constitution of the United States is built upon. Government cannot hold anyone in prison unless they bring charges and prove it in a court of law before the peers of those that are being tried. Thomas Jefferson once wrote, as he says in this article, to James Madison concerning habeas corpus. He said that it allows a citizen to be able to have the government prove in court that it has the legal authority to hold him in prison. And if it doesn't prove it in court, then he's to be released. But Attorney General John Ashcroft wants to get rid of habeas corpus, this writ, the great writ that protects you and me and every other citizen, no matter where they come from the government. This would have been placed into the Patriot Act if it hadn't been for one person, a man from Wisconsin by the name of Sensenbrenner. He is the one who discovered that they were going to take away this right of habeas corpus, and he is the one that stated that over his dead body would they ever get it passed in America. I'm here to tell you, many great patriots of the past who were protecting America, and they are political figures, have been found dead, and it was over their dead body that certain legislation was passed. I hope for the best for this man. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. He goes on in this article. And he said that it was later found in Ex parte Millikan. The Supreme Court declared that it was illegal, that the court system in America was still in force, and yet how could they suspend the Constitution? Even in Lincoln's time, anybody that disagreed with what he was doing, going to war against the South, was picked up and paraded before a military tribunal, and they were put into prison, and their habeas corpus rights were suspended. And the Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional. And so it is that Mr. Nate Hentoff, one of the great men of America in understanding the Constitution, has written about it and is telling us what to fear in the future, because America is in deep trouble without the American population even know what is happening to it. There was another huge article called Ashcroft Pushes Secret Police Powers. This was from the Fort Smith, Arkansas newspaper also, and it goes into great depths telling about how the Patriot II Act is already producing repercussions for Americans, how that those who disagree with them, the government, President George W. Bush's administration, and especially Attorney General John Ashcroft, are now being accused of everything short of the word treason, and he says it right here. The lady, Mary Ann Means, wrote the article. She wrote it straightforward. There was no beating around the bush about it. She told it like it is. She said Ashcroft has been on a national campaign trying to convince not the public, not you and me, but friendly law officers that the Patriot II Act, or the Patriot Act, was limited only to those who would create terrorism. Yet, she said in this article, in a nationally syndicated, and it went all over the country, the article said clearly that the government is now stretching who can be fit into one of these terrorists to the point where now anyone that is declared an enemy combatant can be taken off the streets. This is a very, very convincing article. 160 communities and 3 states have already adopted resolutions declaring that the Patriot Act is illegal and unconstitutional. That's getting pretty serious, and it's a backlash against everything that is being talked about. But I want to give you one more article before I go into the main body of the message. All this is laying the groundwork to show you that things are really happening in America. In the USA paper, USA Today, April 1st, 1999, Dateline, Tucson, Arizona. Under the watchful eye of Ukrainian officials. Who are Ukrainians? A part of the former communist bloc, but it is not former, it is still communist. The Air Force continued to demolish B-52 bombers at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. The total number destroyed thus far is 266. The Ukrainians were involved to witness the bombers' destruction after some questioned whether the United States was complying with a strategic arms reduction treaty. End of quote. So we're being disarmed. Alarming laws are being passed to take away our civil liberties. All of these things that are happening in your lifetime and my lifetime, we are told to watch world news in the light of Bible prophecy. We're also told in 1 Thessalonians 5:20 that we should not despise prophesying. We should understand that God laid down in the Bible 1/3 of it as prophecy so that we could understand where we fit into the scheme of things. And when the end of the age came, we would recognize it for what it is. I personally entered into Harding College in Searcy, Arkansas in 1959 as a freshman. The college was founded by a man, Dr. George S. Benson. He created what is called the Freedom Foundation. We would have 45-minute assemblies every single day where they would show us slides of communism, the threat to our government, the threat to our religion, the threat to our family, the threat to our total way of life, and how they wanted to overthrow every single nation on the face of the earth and rebuild it from the bottom up. This is exactly what is prophesied in the book of Revelation. I graduated in 1965 after staying out of school 2 years to work for the money to continue my schooling. God called me into the ministry in 1980. There were 4 men in October of 1981 that ordained me into the ministry. God called me to understand Bible prophecy. I don't apologize for it. He's the one that called me. People ask me many times, how do you know so much about world events and the history that applies to Bible prophecy? I simply answer, I study. I watch, as Jesus said. One man even said, how could anybody know so much about it unless they were a part of the Illuminati? Well, proofs of conspiracy. Many people don't understand exactly what is going on in the world today, but there was a man by the name of John Robeson back in 1798 wrote a book called Proofs of a Conspiracy. In that particular book, he outlined Adam Weishaupt, who founded the Illuminati May 1st, 1776. He laid down how the Freemasonry from the 33rd degree and up, and the Illuminati merged in 1782 so that they could infiltrate every form of government in the world today. And from within, as well as revolutionary wars from without, they could destroy nation after nation after nation. And then there was another book that was published called The Fourth Reich of the Rich. This particular book gave a history of the Illuminati. Adam Weishaupt founded it May 1st, 1776. The book gives an overview all the way up to the Ronald Reagan years, in which it proved beyond a shadow of a doubt from all the documentation within its pages how the Illuminati worked, who they were, how they infiltrated countries, how they took over governments through the central banking system, and they would control the money supply and take it out of the hands of the particular government so that they would become indebted to the bankers. And then another book came on the scene called World Revolution. It was published in 1921. It gives the history of Illuminism, as it calls it, the Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt. It goes through the French Revolution, and it shows that it was the Illuminati that started the French Revolution to overthrow that country as the first country to be set up as a socialist communist state. But it failed after a short period of time. It went through, the Illuminati spread to England, to Ireland, to the United States, and all the other countries of the world. They showed the International, which was a communist international, and it founded what we call as modern-day international communism. It was to be for the masses of the people to consume it and to believe it. It went right through the Russian Revolution of 1917 to 1919, proving who was behind it and all the various networks working together under the term communist apparatus. And then also there's other books, and we have many of them. This particular one is called The Civil War. And these particular books concerning the Civil War gives a background as to why the Civil War happened. It was for the destruction of states' rights, because this country was founded upon each individual state was an independent nation, and they only delegated certain authority to the federal government in Washington, D.C. But today, everything is the opposite. The federal government controls all the states, and there is no longer states' rights. It goes through the slavery issue and how it was promoted. But the real cause of the Civil War was states' rights. They had to destroy the South, who was standing up against the northern states of Massachusetts and so on that wanted to have an all-powerful central federal government and destroy the Constitution and overlook it. And therefore the southern states did not have a right to their own destiny anymore. So they had to be destroyed. Then there are other books that have been published, one called The South Was Right. It goes in great detail, a comprehensive study of the myths that are passed on by the news media and so on as to why the South left and they seceded from the Union. It showed in that book they had an orderly secession from the Union that was taught by the United States Military Academy in 1825 and 1826. It was taught from a textbook that was sanctioned by the government of the United States. William Raleigh wrote the book. He was the Attorney General of the state of New York. And his textbook taught states how to secede from the Union orderly, just like they met in council in their Senate and House of Representative buildings. They voted to go into the Union so they would meet in council once again and vote to withdraw their delegations from Washington, D.C. and not be represented, and they would leave the Union. This was taught in the military academy, paid for by the government of the United States in 1825 and 1826. This particular book, The South Was Right, it followed those steps and showed that the 11 southern states followed them. But the North, that was controlled by the Illuminati, they began to destroy the Southern secession and their rights. They went through in this book and showed that Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1864 to 1873, his name was Salomon Chase. And later on, the Chase Manhattan Bank and all of his relatives controlled it. He stated that with the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox, Virginia, states' rights ended, and now the federal government in Washington, D.C. was the supreme authority over all states. Now do we understand why the old phrase, you can't fight City Hall? Because the states can do us no good anymore. The federal government has all power. The exact opposite of what the Constitution says. Then there was a book that was written that unveils the mystery of the money system in America called the Federal Reserve System. This particular book explains the purposes and the functions of the Federal Reserve System from the point of bankers. What it doesn't tell you was what former President Ronald Reagan said in his very first State of the Union message in 1981. He said the Federal Reserve is an autonomous organization. That means it's private, it's independent, it's not even listed under government in the blue pages. It's listed in the white pages as a private bank. And they set their own interest rates for their own purposes. And it's been proven through the years those purposes is to finance international communism and one world government. It controls our government by raising or lowering interest rates so that they will give us a good economy or a bad economy. They will drive officers from government so they won't be reelected if they're a threat to expose them. Or they will give someone a good economy to keep their man in who further subjugates the American people for their new world order. Then another book was written. It was called The Creature from Jekyll Island. And in this book, it explains in simple terms the gigantic fraud of the Federal Reserve System. That is, those words are right on every single bill that you have in your wallet. It's no longer United States silver note or gold note. It is the Federal Reserve note. It explains that there was a secret conspiratorial meeting in Jekyll Island, Georgia, That's the playground at one time of these world elite, the ultra-rich. And the meeting was by those who were working for world government. They proposed a central bank for the United States of America, and we had rejected it all through the years, and that's why it was inserted into our Constitution that only the government could coin money so that the central banks could not get their hands upon it, because then they would charge interest. You can't owe yourself something if you're a government and you print your own money. There is no interest attached to it. Yet one of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto says that every nation on earth must have a central bank in the hands of those working for world government, so they can control the economy of every single nation. And so, how would they ever be able to fulfill the Bible in Revelation chapter 13, verse 16 and 17 about the mark of the beast? And nobody would be able to buy or sell unless they had the mark, unless they control the entire economy of the world. So another huge book was written called The Secrets of the Temple. And it proved beyond a shadow of a doubt how the Federal Reserve System now controls this country, every aspect of it. Its economics. It was created by world government conspirators. To be exact, one of those conspirators wrote an article for the Saturday Evening Post, which is no longer published, back in the 1920s and 30s. And he said that he was one who went down to Jekyll Island, Georgia. He went in the private car of a senator from Rhode Island. And they went down, and they wouldn't give their names because it was total secret. And they formulated the plan by which they would introduce the Federal Reserve Act into Congress. And the bankers manipulated the United States in 1907 and had a bank failure. And that precipitated our government accepting the Federal Reserve Act. And it was all done by the international bankers. How can you owe yourself anything? If you borrow $20 from your kitty that you put back in your savings account, you don't have to pay yourself interest, do you? Only when you borrow from someone else do you have to pay interest. That's when you create debt. Why does the United States government and the private sector in this country have about $27 trillion in total debt? It's because we owe somebody. And if it's not ourselves, then it's got to be somebody else. And that's what these books, The Secrets of the Temple, reveals who it is. But what they don't tell you is that when you can't repay for your house or your car note, they come and confiscate it, don't they? International bankers finance governments. Governments and all the people and their assets are put up as collateral. And when the government can't pay it back, those who are now in control of the government put people as advisors on the committees. The bankers, then they pass laws that only further erode the constitutional rights of the people and take us into slavery. This is how they've done it without firing a shot so far. And then there's another book called The Socialist Network by Nesta Webster. This book was written way back in 1926. It documents the origin of modern socialism. It documents how Karl Marx was only a very limited figure in the socialist movement. He was bought and paid for by higher people. It proves that they wanted to use anarchy and then war and pacifism in some cases to overthrow governments, to bring them into a world government. It discusses in that particular book, The Socialist Network, the Russian Revolution, who started it, who was behind it, who financed it. This was better known as the Bolshevik Revolution, and it became communist. It proves in the pages of that particular book that the communists began to move into Great Britain. Then they began to capture the trade unions in Britain, and then in the United States. They were the next target. It revealed in that particular book the communist organization right up to the time it was printed in 1926, how they would use the pacifism or peace movements to gain strides. They would use youth movements, the young communist leagues of Great Britain, the young communist leagues of America, young communist leagues of Germany, so that they could alter the governments. Finally, it discusses socialism and its all-out war against Christianity and to obliterate it off the face of the earth. Then another book came out, and I'm very happy to reveal to you that this man by the name of James Wardner, college professor, called me and said that he watched our television program, and he could not believe what he was hearing, so he began to do his own research. And he found that everything I was saying was true and much, much more, and he got it right out of the documents of the libraries in the state of Florida, and he wrote the book Unholy Alliances. He wrote another book also, but this is the one I'm going to mention today. In it, he absolutely proves by the Senate Subcommittee on Un-American Activities documents starting in 1931 on down through 1953 that our government has been infiltrated by Illuminati agents called communists. They are communists and 33rd degree Freemasons that are revealed the secrets of world government. In all of this, he also documents the infiltration into our government in education, the NEA, and how it's become a communist tool to get God out of the picture, out of the schools in America. How that they infiltrated religion and changed many of the major denominations in America that once was on fire the best they knew how. Religiously, they've changed them to social clubs. And you cannot learn any truth from them anymore because they're on their boards at the very highest level over all the other churches. And then they educate what was called pink ministers who would go out. Over 7,000 ministers were named back in the 1950s and 60s as having graduated and become pink ministers that was taking God and the power of the Holy Spirit out of the Bible. Then they said they proved it from the House Un-American or Senate Subcommittee on Un-American Activities that they were to infiltrate Hollywood, the movie industry, and the news media, so that you and I would only be able to see what they wanted to promote. And they wanted to promote ugliness. Everything that is a sin and called a sin in the Bible, they promoted it as good. And so they called good evil and evil good. Then there was another book called A Study of Communism. And what I want you to see is these people that are writing these books that I have educated myself from are not just Johnny-come-latelys, people off the street. This was the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. He was the head of it for many, many years. In that particular book, he described world communist membership and how it had increased worldwide, and only 3% of the population could take over an entire nation. He described what appeals to certain groups, and then their disillusionment when their hopes can't be realized. And that's the only reason they've learned so much about communism, when some of them have been disillusioned and reported what they had been taught, how to be a communist and their goals and their aims of destruction. In this book on the study of communism, it showed how communism hopes to achieve its goal to overthrow our country through propaganda after they gain control of the news media and the movie Hollywood lots. They would use front groups such as the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, others, the Institute for Pacific Relations, and others, the Council on Foreign Relations. They showed in J. Edgar Hoover's book, A Study on Communism, the infiltration into non-communist organizations to neutralize them so they wouldn't speak out against communism anymore and bring fear to the American people, so that they wouldn't pass laws to outlaw communism and the Communist Party so that it could openly operate within the borders of America. Then he also showed in this book how there was a systematic campaign to recruit members from college campuses in the United States. And because of infiltration into the Ivy League schools, this has been their most fertile ground. Harvard, Princeton, and the others, the Ivy League schools. Then another book was written called Masters of Deceit by J. Edgar Hoover also. What he stated inside the pages of this book, and he proved it, was what the communist dictators are doing to bring America to their knees. How that they would legislate socialism little by little in America, and we would wake up one day and become a socialist communist nation and not even know how it happened. He discussed in there Karl Marx, V.I. Lenin, Joseph Stalin, how United States communism began. Then the communist appeal to the U.S. population that lives in the ghettos, because they say that one day the masses are going to rule, when it's not true at all. International communism, only the very rich and the elite will rule the entire world, and everybody else will be slaves. He points out in that book how communist strategy and tactics, mass agitation, such as the training in Mount Eagle, Tennessee, of Martin Luther King Jr. to agitate the population of his race so they could overthrow the country. But it didn't work. But they did have great strides as a result from it. He pointed out in that book how their underground networks function, the espionage system, the sabotage system, so that they could bring America at a certain point in history to its knees and merge us into an all-powerful socialist, communist, one-world government. And then he also discussed in this book, Masters of Deceit, how that communism is a false religion. It is a religion, but it's false. Then J. Edgar Hoover's assistant, by the name of W. Cleon Skousen, wrote the book, The Naked Communist. All of this fulfills Bible prophecy, but it gives you the background as to how this world dictatorship is coming about. In this particular book, The Naked Communist, it shows the founders of communism, once again, their belief system, that they were worshipers of Lucifer, Satan, the devil. Then it gives the rise of the revolutionary movement in Russia, the purpose for creating a seen enemy against the Western world of Christianity. Only the seen enemy would be atheism. You set up two opposites to come into conflict with one another. And then one begins to compromise so that you don't have an all-out war. And when the atomic bomb was developed, then it became atomic war, then a nuclear holocaust. And so they used these, atheism against Christianity, so that they could compromise and little by little gain control over the Christian world. They showed in that book, The Naked Communist, about communism and World War II, and how the infiltrators of communism into our State Department used our own government to advance communist causes all over the world. They showed how communist attacks on the free world after World War II were taking place, and how that many people in our own government, it was warned, and the presidents of the United States knew it. Their names were given on list. The documents were there, and our presidents just totally ignored it and would do nothing about it. In that book, The Naked Communist, It also gave the communist timetable of conquest. How that they would overcome certain third and fourth world countries, work their way up through South America, right on up into Mexico. They would have the United States surrounded, and after they had surrounded the United States, then it would collapse because they would have infiltrated from within. They would have used psychological warfare on the population of America to make us think that communism was inevitable and that we cannot stop it. So they sent us to wars in Vietnam, and we couldn't win the first time we had a treaty and put our tail between our legs and drug ourselves home without a victory. He went on to show the communist goals for world domination, world dictatorship, how that they would use peaceful coexistence rather than nuclear war. And all the time they would be infiltrating our country until it would collapse from within and they would have us. Then discussed in the book The Naked Communists by Cleon Skousen, assistant to J. Edgar Hoover, was the United Nations. How that it was founded by international communism to become a one-world communist government. And how that all of the dictates right now, those who finance it, from he who has will finance. And the United States is the richest nation in the world, so they finance it the most. And yet we're the ones that are voted against by all the third and fourth world communist socialist countries. And yet we finance it the most. He went on in this book, The Naked Communists, and told what is the secret weapon of communism. He said there was a connection between communism and the United Nations. The United Nations would be a front so that we in America would never suspect that we were being merged into communism because they wouldn't call it communism. Then there was the book, The Fearful Master, A Second Look at the United Nations. And this particular book proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that communism absolutely, undeniably controls the United Nations. The United Nations is using psychological warfare to capture the American minds. It uses terrorism against America so they can pass laws to further erode our freedoms and bring us into a controlled society. In that book, it showed the uses, case histories of a free nation that was forced to become communist, such as Katanga in Africa, such as China, how it was betrayed by our State Department and the withholding of money. So there couldn't be any more supplies for the military, so Chiang Kai-shek had to retreat on the island of Formosa. It showed the United Nations was designed by communists to be a communist world government. And once we're in it and all of our military is turned over to it, and that's what they're banking upon, there is no return. There is no way to get away from the United Nations because they will have all power, all the military in the world. And when you read Revelation 13, verse 4, it is specific. It says, who is going to be able to make war with the beast once they have all the military in the world, the nuclear arsenal of America? And we have destroyed our B-52 bombers. We've been destroying our nuclear weapons out in West Texas. And so we're becoming an unarmed nation. There will be no way, according to Bible prophecy, for us to resist world government. And it's the sins of the nation. That's why God is allowing it to happen. He doesn't have to let it happen, but it's the sins of the nation. And the nation will be punished for its sins. And that's why God has allowed this thing to occur. But then there is another book called Global Tyranny, Step by Step. In this particular book, it discusses the New World Army that is proposed by international communism. The United Nations uses the cover of peace all over the world to enforce its will upon nation after nation. It proves in the pages of that book the United Nations founders were communists. The Council on Foreign Relations, a United States elite organization, are members. And they're all promoting world government. It also shows that treaties that are treasonous, that the Constitution of the United States can never allow a treaty that would take away the supremacy of our Constitution and change our laws. That would change the federal law, the state law, and yet they have done it and continue to do it. That's how they're merging us into this all-powerful world government. In that book, Global Tyranny, Step by Step, it proves the United Nations is using environmental issues to gain control. We're guaranteed in the Constitution that we can have private property. But they're using environmental issues to forbid us from building in certain areas, confiscating lands in other areas, putting laws so that if we don't abide by the laws, they can take our property away from us. This is all a design. The United Nations wants to control our children. They said, give us two generations of your children in public school, and public school is one of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, paid for by the federal government. Give us 2 generations without God, without the Bible, without prayer in the schools, we'll have your nation. How close are we from 1962 when they banned it in America? Think about Hillary Clinton, who could possibly become a president of the United States, and how she wants the government to take over the rearing of children, just like in every communist country. Then in that book, Global Tyranny, it showed that the United Nations war to reduce the population of the world is going on, but they never bring out in the open who is doing it. The United Nations is the one behind the sterilization of people in foreign countries, India, the populous countries of the world. They're the ones that instigated AIDS in America. They found it in laboratories in Fort Detrick, Maryland, so that they could introduce it into the homosexual society and they could use it to reduce the population of the world. It also reveals that the United Nations World Monetary System, the IMF, is designed to redistribute the wealth of the world. And that's one of the planks of the Communist Manifesto. Take away from the rich nations, the United States, Britain, Western Europe, give to the third and fourth world countries. The more you earn, the more is taken away so they can redistribute it and somebody else can have a better income, even though they don't work for it. Then it also discussed in Global Tyranny the new world religion that's coming, and it will be non-Christian. It will not be Christianity. It discusses regionalism, how they've already divided up the world into 10 global groupings of nations. Just like Daniel chapter 2 of the Bible says the 10 toes. 10. The world has already been divided up on a computer model into 10 global groupings of nations for the New World Order. Each one will have a king over it, and they'll give their authority to the one great king that will be sitting in Jerusalem, Palestine, claiming to be God. It's called apotheosis, elevating a human being into the ranks of the gods. And people will be required to worship him because there'll be a false prophet that is working miracles before the world to deceive them. There was a man who has been in many, many promotions for one world government. His name is David Rockefeller. Here's what he said. He belongs to all the ultra-elite billionaire associations, and he was at a Bilderberger meeting. Here's what he said. We're grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of silence. For almost 40 years, it would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity during these years. End of quote. So the news media is linked up to destroying America also, hiding the very fact that there are those who are trying to create a world government after their own theories, their own ways. Mr. Henry Kissinger, I want to quote him, May 21st, 1992. If you remember Mr. Henry Kissinger, when Nixon left office, he was the Secretary of State. He was the most powerful man in the United States at that time. Many people suspected him as being a former communist. They didn't want him to be the most powerful man in America. They took a vote in the Senate and the House as to whether they trusted him or not, and he barely won. Here's what he said when he left the Bilderberger meeting in 1992. Today, America would be outraged if United Nations troops entered Los Angeles to restore order. Tomorrow, they'll be grateful. This is especially true if they were told there was an outside threat from beyond, whether real or promulgated or manufactured, made up, that threatened our very existence. It is then that all peoples of the world will pledge with world leaders to deliver them from this evil. The one thing every man fears is the unknown. When represented with this scenario, individual rights will be willingly relinquished for the guarantee of their well-being granted to them by their world government. End of quote. He knew there was going to be a world government. There was not a problem for him because he was one up to his eyeballs in subverting America. Here is a book called The Secret Conversations of Henry Kissinger. And it absolutely proves that he was a double agent. For communism, his code name was Boer, and he was posing as a United States friend. He was more deadly to America and its foreign policy when he was in authority than any other man during the Nixon years. And there is another book, Henry Kissinger, Soviet Agent, absolutely documents his Soviet connections all through the years, starting in World War II. And he went right on down, and he was placed in authority by David Rockefeller and brought to the attention of the American government. And he was instructed and taught for years by those who had been working for world government, the international bankers. Then there's another book, You Can Trust the Communists to Do Exactly What They Say. Or you can trust the communists to be communist. In this particular book, it details the recruiting of communists from college campuses. It details the origin and organization of the Communist Party. That it's a conspiracy at the very highest magnitude, the highest level in the United States government, in the British government. And it's conceived in the mind of the one they worship, Lucifer, and passed on to his human agents. Lucifer is Satan. In that book, you can trust the communists to be communist and to do exactly what they say. It discusses many communist front organizations in America, how they capture non-suspecting organizations and use them as front organizations, doing the communist bidding without them even realizing it. And then it discusses the techniques for seizing power in a nation, how they have done it successfully in nation after nation, and they're working in America today. It discusses, once a nation is captured, how to consolidate the power to guarantee that nation will remain in the hands of a dictator. Now do you understand why I read the newspaper articles at the beginning showing that they're trying to create a dictatorship in America right now. Once they've gained power, they've got to be in a position to install a dictator instantly. That particular book shows the allies of Communist Lenin and how that he started the Bolshevik Communist Party in 1903 with only 17 members. By 1917, he had 40,000 members, and they overthrew Russia. Millions of population, but only 40,000 people overthrew the entire government. It documents by 1959 they had conquered 1 billion people in one generation. One generation of godless communists brought under its control. 12 times as many as Hitler ever ruled over. 12 times more than Japan ever ruled over. 6 times the United States population at that time. Then it discussed the brainwashing through the media and education, because they wanted public education to pass on their particular items that they were trying to promote at that time. Then there is another book. It's called the Communist Manifesto. The very principles which they are trying to establish in every single nation on the face of the earth. Karl Marx was paid to write it. It was Adam Weishaupt's program, and Karl Marx brought it up to date. All 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto are now installed in the United States of America in a corporate way. Not on the governmental level, but business level. This is how close they are to having America. Then there is another book that was put out, What We Must Know About Communism. It describes the men behind the theory of communism and the roots of the communist conspiracy. It discusses the revolution by force and how it became a permanent part of their agenda to overthrow governments. And it fulfills Revelation 6, the red horse, to take peace from the earth and kill mankind. And so they do. They kill up to half every population which they overthrow, so that they can eliminate anyone that will not fit themselves into their communist mode, their communist new man. It discusses the tactics of international communism, the strategies to be used against the United States for its overthrow. Then the communist target groups for destruction. Individual groups like the John Birch Society, how they use certain tactics to discredit them in the minds of the masses of the people. How they would use the mass media, the public media that everybody is exposed to, so that they can just, with a word, 2 words, they can start a rumor which is totally unfounded. And how can you defend yourself against a nationwide media? Anyone that speaks against their program is eventually the target. Just like the senator from Wisconsin, McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy. He had only uncovered 10% of the infiltration into our State Department. He was crucified. They still call it the McCarthy witch hunt era today, when it wasn't at all. He was telling the truth. But anyone that comes out, they now have the ability to crucify them and shut their mouth. Then the book Conquest Without War. All the statements by Nikita Khrushchev and how that he came to the United Nations organization and stood up in public in 1959 and said, whether you like it or not, we're going to have your country. And it proves that their goal was and still world triumph, world government. And America was the final conquest. They would use our money first, and then they would take us. They hope to take us by legislation and not by war. But that will not happen. There will be war. Then there is the book, A Documentary History of Communism. In this particular book, it discusses the evolution of the communist mind in the world today, how it came about, where it's headed, taking the world, their world revolution program, and how it is on target right now. The destabilizing of a country and then stabilizing it under communist control, then expansion to the next country. They discuss the European communist Antonio Gramsci and his program for world domination, especially to be used in the United States to destroy our Christian culture first before they could take the nation. And there is a war against America and Christianity right now in the court system by the American Civil Liberties Union, which is a communist organization. There are 6,000 lawsuits against individual Christians, Christian churches, Christian organizations, and against judges and so on that are trying to keep Christianity in America. Their program is working. Then it discussed the rise of communism in China and how the United States State Department aided in that. It discussed American communism, their goals, their purposes, their timetables. And then it discussed the communists and the Spanish Civil War, how that they were the ones behind it. It discussed Chinese communism under Mao Zedong to be the model for the rest of the world, to eliminate much of the population, to bring a censorship of childbirth and limit the production of children to one per family. Any above that, there would be penalties of withholding food from individuals since they had the control. Then it talked about the expansion of communism westward, how that they would use guerrilla warfare, revolution in places like Yugoslavia and in South and Central America. It discussed the Yalta Conference, in which the big three, Churchill of Britain, Roosevelt of America, Stalin of Russia, gave Eastern Europe to the communists with a stroke of a pen. How that America did not try to win the war the first 2 years, but they just dilly-dallied around and let Russia come down and meet them in Berlin. And therefore, since they had the territory, they wrote with a stroke of a pen and gave it to them. Then it discussed how they would use the Cold War to advance their program and lull America to sleep. How that there would be coups d'etats in Czechoslovakia, which there were. Then the use of the Berlin blockade, the division of Germany into East and West, and eventually merging them together again to pretend that communism was dead when it wasn't. And they would lull us to sleep, the Western world of Christianity, until their day came. It discussed national communism in Hungary and finally world communism in 1959 with the invasion of Russian tanks. It discussed the expansion of communism eastward into China, the overthrow of China's Chiang Kai-shek, staunch ally, trained, educated in America, the one who was going to implement the United States Constitution in China. He was destroyed. It discussed North Korea, Vietnam, India, and Indonesia. How that there would be guerrilla warfare in Vietnam. And that's how they would take the Asiatic countries. Then it discussed the policy of coexistence so that America would not use military might to destroy the advances of communism. They discussed the revolutions in Cambodia, Afghanistan, national liberation movements in Africa, Central America, and then the Iranian Revolution, in which the Ayatollahs, religious leaders, took over the country. And then there was another book called Mesmerized by the Bear, the Soviet Strategy of Deception. This particular book showed their empire is built upon lies to deceive the world. They use deception in arms control. While America is destroying their B-52 bombers, they're building at breakneck speed so they can have at least a 6 to 8-1 ratio of weapons over us, ready for an attack if they cannot take us internally, and we collapse and they take us peacefully. It showed the deception in the nuclear weapons development and how they deployed them in various places around the world and hidden them from us. Their nuclear surprise attack plan that they have on the books right now. How that peace treaties were to be used and then, just like a pie crust, to be broken. But they would use it to cause America to disarm. They would use this deception in America and all the Western civilized countries. They would use deception through word. It's called doublespeak. We want peace, when they already stated there can be no peace in the world till the whole world is communist. So when they say we want peace, that's true in their terminology, but we're going to overthrow your government so that we can arrive at peace. When there is no opposition, no other form of government but communism, then the world will have peace. They mean that the whole world is to be communist. Then peace will be arrived. They use deception in religion, making the Western world think that Christianity is alive and well in China, Russia, and the other communist countries, when they have a church state. And the in-home churches are the ones who are persecuted, put in prison. Their ministers are sought out. They're either killed or imprisoned. Then they use economic deception. They need our aid. Then they use that aid for the development of mass weapons of destruction. Every communist country is that way. That's why they got us to pass in 1947 the Foreign Aid Act, so that every nation on the face of the earth would be receiving foreign aid, even the communist countries. Then they use deception and détente. They said it's a period of peace when it wasn't. They were building militarily, preparing for the countdown. So happens a book, Countdown, was written, showing that doomsday is coming and that it is inevitable. They have already made all of their statements saying that America and Russia, it's inevitable that we're going to have an all-out war to destroy, the Illuminati said, both communism and atheism at the same time. Then their true New World Order can rise on the rubbles of that destruction. Then there is the book, The Last Days of America. It shows the complete destruction of America as we know it. Our court system, our constitution, everything, religious system that we were founded upon. Then there are other books of history called The Harvest of Sorrow. What happens when people do not want to be communist? And so here was a communist government called Ukraine that was overthrown by the communists. And it documents the systematic murder of the peasant farmers in Ukraine. Over 7 million were starved deliberately. They wouldn't allow airlifts of food to go into the Ukraine because these people did not want to become communist. And they stood up against them. So all roads were blocked. All mountain passes, all riverways. No aircraft were allowed to fly in, and they starved to death 7 million of the opposition to communism, till finally they were subjugated. This is what we have to look forward to in America, Bible prophecy. Then there is the book, From the Secret Files of J. Edgar Hoover, where he has one section that discusses subversive activities in America that's going on. He discusses federal employees and how many of those have been identified as communist or communist sympathizers, socialists aiding the enemy. He goes into the discussion of labor unions, how they're controlled by communists, and universities where many of our graduated students from high school go to, and how they're controlled, most of them by international communists or those leaning towards socialism, communism, a one-world government. He goes through in this secret files of of J. Edgar Hoover, the civil rights groups of the 1960s and 70s. He showed how Dr. Martin Luther King was manipulated and he received money from 60 Communist Front organizations. He was trained at a communist school that the state of Tennessee disbanded. The legislature disbanded it because of its communist activities. I even have a picture of him sitting on the front row between three of the most notorious communists in the country, learning how to create Molotov cocktails, learning how to stir up the emotions of people so they would become agitators. He discusses in this secret files the educational programs in America, how the communists have taken over, dissemination of information to the media, how they are the ones who control that dissemination to the media, so the media can only give off their propaganda. And then he went into the discussion of Hollywood hearings on actors and how that over 300 were identified in the House Subcommittee on Un-American Activities as pro-communist and communist sympathizers, and at least 300 were card-carrying communists. And then there is the book, Communism and the New Left. In this particular book, it details individuals working to overthrow the United States government now. Then there's the book, Russia Shakes the World, where it goes into showing us how they think. And if there's a second Russian revolution, that Russia, they say, is no longer a threat. But it really is. It's a pretense. And it was written by a New Ager by the name of Gary Hart, who used to be in Congress in Washington, D.C. Then there is another book entitled The Sixth Continent, in which Mikhail Gorbachev's role in the Soviet Union was to bring about glasnost and perestroika. Pretend to the world that there is now the dissolving of communism. We're going to have a market economy and the world will fall for it. And yet he told their Duma, their parliament, don't you worry about the cosmetic things that are happening in Russia. We will never deviate from the program of communism. These are only cosmetic to fool the Western world. And here is a book by Mikhail Gorbachev, Perestroika. And it's a totally different version, the one that is found in Eastern Europe in the communist countries. He has settled it down a little bit for America's consumption. But it's selling the West on the idea that communism is dead, no longer a threat. However, the Iron Curtain, communist countries' version, was radically different. They said they were using perestroika to actually strengthen socialism and communism. This is what we're facing in the world today. Total deception. Satan is the deceiver of the whole world. He's deceived Christianity, supposedly the Western world of Christianity, into believing that communism is dead when it is not. Then there's the book Marxism in the USA. This particular book tells how socialists immigrated to America between 1865 and 1900 to prepare America and for others who would eventually come to change this government to communism. It would be the effort to change our culture from Christian, undermine our Christian identity, our Christian heritage, our morality in this country to prepare us for socialism, communism. Then there was a book, The Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This particular book tells of the beginning years of communism in Russia. It's from Lenin to Stalin, how that they consolidated power by killing massive millions of individuals. They would herd them onto boxcars and send them out into Siberia and work them on bread and water till they fell dead. Then they would go get another boxcar full to replace them. And how people would just be snatched off the street in the middle of the night, and their family would never hear from them again. Now do you understand why I read to you that article where they want to do away with habeas corpus in America so they could take you off the street if they consider you as an enemy combatant and nobody would ever hear from you again. Identical to the program of international socialism and communism. That particular book, The Communist Party of the Soviet Union, discussed Stalin's rise to power and what an evil man he was. The rise and fall of Nikita Khrushchev. And then there are other books called The Red Guard. This particular book is a thorough description of Chairman Mao of China, his overthrow, then the consolidation of power in China, the use of young people to enforce and then terrorize the population into obedience to this new regime which they had installed. Then there was a man who left the Soviet Union. He defected. His name was Anatolian Golitsyn. He understood communism. He was high in it. He wrote a book called New Lies for Old. He was an ex-KGB officer, and he warned America how communist deception threatens the survival of the West. He told the FBI about Soviet disinformation, how that they are saying they are weak in that country, economically destabilized. They need American help. They wanted to pretend that they were disunited in their goals, not united anymore as a communist world, but each state would be different and separate. He told how they had laid down the plan in advance to pretend military weakness while building and using every dollar they could get from the West to build their military equipment for the inevitable day when they would come onto the mountains of the United States of America. They said that they would pretend weakness, but build. America would become their friend, they said, and would disarm, and then they would strike when our guard is down. He told the whole story of the deception that is taking place in America today. Then there is another book called Treason in America. That particular book takes us from Aaron Burr all the way to Averell Harriman, a one-worlder, a banker international. It details the British and Swiss Secret Service in the United States of America, such individuals as Benedict Arnold, Aaron Burr, Albert Gallatin, trying to bring the whole continent under British rule and to undermine the newly formed United States of America. The book goes on and tells about the Civil War and the fighting factions of high Freemasons of the Scottish Rite as who would be in control of the United States of America once they overthrew it. Then there's the book, none dare call it Conspiracy. It was written by a man by the name of Gary Allen, sold over 7 million copies. It told how socialism is being used by the super rich, the international bankers, the great industrialists of the world, such as Arm & Hammer. It told about international bankers and their bankrolling the Bolshevik Revolution and how they would use the communists to gain an empire for the world and they would control it. They specifically told the background of the Rockefellers in America and the communists, that they were the only foreign bank in the world that had a bank at number 1 Red Square. And it described the tactics of pressure by the rich from above who controlled everything, the economy, and then from the street radicals below that they would pressure the middle class in between, squeezing us into socialism, communism, and being willing to accept legislation to guarantee our security and our safety. But it all leads straight to socialism, communism. Then the book None Dare Call It Treason 25 years later. It gives the origin of world communism. It gives the growth of world communism. It told about such words as peace versus action. Then the book describes how it is happening in the United States of America through education, subverting our religious heritage, uses the press, the radio, TV to propagandize us, and it uses mental health and that type of psychology against the American people. They showed in this book how they had infiltrated the labor organizations back in the 40s and 50s and still have control to this day. How the tax-exempt foundations, such as the Rockefeller Foundations, the Rockefeller Brother Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and so on, how that they all were using and funneling their money for socialistic, communistic causes, because they will be in control of the one world government under socialism, communism. They financed it. They control the people who are working in Russia and other parts of the world. They expose in this book how America has built the Soviet military, how our corporations in this country went there and built factories that would build their military equipment for them. Then it also told how the use of treaties would entrap us with the Soviets and the United Nations organizations illegally. But America would be propagandized to believe that they were correct. And then it described our own leaders, how that they were betraying us. Certain ones were members of subversive organizations, such as the Council on Foreign Relations, founded by Edward Mandel House down here in Austin, Texas. He was a Marxist, founded the organization in 1919, incorporated in 1921. David Rockefeller was the chairman of the board for many, many years. Then the Trilateral Commission, the Atlantic Alliance, and the Bilderbergers, and other world-known organizations, how that they were working through them to entrap America and put us into world government. Then he discusses how communism and the communist plan is conquest without war if possible, otherwise a sneak attack, because they control the media. They would not tell us the nukes are coming. Then he discussed how communism kills all opposition, whether they're the educated, whether they are government officials and religious officials. They kill anyone who stands in their way of accomplishing their goal. Then there's the book, Call It Conspiracy. It discusses the money power that bankrolled the Bolshevik Revolution, the Communist Revolution. It demonstrates how Presidents Nixon, Ford, Carter, and so on were used in the conspiracy to destroy America. They were used as puppets in the hands of other people, their advisors. And then this Mr. James Wardner, college professor down in Florida, who watched our television program and decided he would do a little research on his own, wrote a book called The Planned Destruction of America, because he couldn't believe the things that I was saying. So he had to prove it for himself. He did, out of his own research. He came to the conclusion and reported in that book, The Planned Destruction of America, that the Federal Reserve System manipulates the economy of America. It gives inflation and deflation, higher interest rates, lower for their purposes at that moment. It proved that the Federal Reserve System is privately owned by 8 international banking conglomerates who finance socialism and communism in Russia. It also, in that book, proved that the Council on Foreign Relations is a subversive organization, and it now controls all powers in Washington, D.C. Everything in Washington, D.C. No wonder they can do whatever they want, and the states can't do a thing. They've destroyed states' rights. Now they have control of our federal government in Washington. He also proved from his own research the part multinational corporations play in the New World economic system. And when the time is right, since all of these various huge conglomerates have many of the same people on the board of directors, of each one of them, how that they will create a system by which it will be total blackout of all money. There will be no checks, no coins. It will be strictly computer. And everybody will do your business transactions with computers. And of course, we know that the Bible says in Revelation 13, 16, and 17 that everybody will receive a mark on the right hand or forehead, and nobody will be able to buy or sell unless they have the mark, or the number of the beast, or the number of his name. So it's coming. He discussed in there how there's a media blackout of the takeover of the United States government so the citizenry would not become aroused. How that many in higher echelons of the FBI and the CIA are a part of it. The lower people are not, but the higher are, those that have the power. Then he discussed a world system called the Bilderbergers, the elite on every continent, the rich billionaires of the world that are in total control. Then the book, The Invisible Government, gives you a history of the Council on Foreign Relations and its Marxist-communist connections. The Council on Foreign Relations' role during World War II. Then the Institute of Pacific Relations, another Communist Front organization, and the Foreign Policy Association, where they would direct American policy, foreign policy, so that they would become communist. And then it also discusses the advising or the Advertising Council, which promotes socialism. It discussed in this book the United Nations and world government propaganda, how they're using all of Marxism in the United Nations, but they just don't say that's what it is. Then they discuss the foreign aid from 1947 to the current time when the book was published, how that the foreign aid from America has drained our riches and gone to all nations of the world and built international communism. And it's set up dictators in all these other countries around the world that have been against us. It discussed the communications media, how they're now in control of ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, CNN. Who was it gave $1 billion to the United Nations? The founder of CNN, Ted Turner, and his communist wife, Jane Fonda. It discussed the interlocking untouchables that could not be touched in America. No matter what they did, they were above the law, and they would never be brought to justice. They discussed the Atlantic Union Committee, which former President George Bush from 1989 to 1992, Vice President 8 years before that as a member of the Atlantic Council. Then it discussed the Trilateral Commission, how that all of these were nothing more than subversive organizations working to destroy America and take our freedoms. Then the Shadows of Power. This particular book fully documents the subversive activities of the Council on Foreign Relations. It uses United States State Department documents. And then he proves in there that they have taken over the State Department, which has helped to overthrow other governments around the world for socialism and communism. And then it proves that we are on the threshold. How many weeks, months, years? I don't know. But how that we're on the threshold of the New World Order and they're taking over. And then there was also the book, America, which the February 15th to the 22nd, 1987 ABC miniseries was based upon. It opened with the United States of America being occupied by United Nations forces, mostly Russian, but it did not tell what happened to bring them to America. It showed internment camps, concentration camps for dissenters. It showed people confined to a certain geographical location and couldn't go beyond it. It showed black helicopters, making sure the population was in submission. It even had one scene where a son of a man, one of the stars of the program, who did not win the presidency, but he stood up in front of all of his schoolmates with a red bandana of international communism, and he held up his hand and said, anyone who will not fit themselves in the New World Order must be killed. Twice, a young boy telling us, propagandizing us, that if you don't fit yourself into the New World Order, there will be war made against you, just like Revelation 13:7 says. But we know our God, and we know that He has other plans for those who are dedicated to Him. Then there's the book, Black Helicopters, where it absolutely proves the history of their beginning to appear over American cities. My wife and I went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. We saw them with our own eyes, and they said, with one of them hanging down in a museum there, that they were night stalkers. They were to be used. It shows in this book the mutilation of animals that took place on farms. Who flew those black helicopters? People who had seen them, they documented. Many of the people who flew them were Chinese, communist. They'll be used in the coming police state. Others who flew them were Wackenhut, which is a security company in Florida that are now running most of the prisons, private prisons in the United States of America, and they use black helicopters. I just wonder why. Then there are other books, AIDS and Rage, Rage and Reality, showing this silent killer, why they have never produced a vaccine and put it into the public to heal those who have AIDS. But they would never have unleashed such a thing on the American public and the world unless they already had a vaccine to protect themselves. It explains the brain deterioration from AIDS, how that AIDS was infected into the heterosexual community as well as the homosexual community. How the transmission of AIDS through body fluids takes place. That it's contagious and it's a secondary disease. How that AIDS and insects interact. How that AIDS and TB go hand in hand and that they become a lethal combination. It discusses patients who have had it. It discusses healthcare workers who are at risk and have gotten it from those that they've been working with. Then the propaganda of safe sex. How that is now being used to cause people not to reproduce, so the population of the world can be going down rather than up. Then there was the book Emerging Viruses. It discusses the World Health Organization and how they are the ones, with the help of the United States government in Fort Meade, Maryland, created it, and they put it in the smallpox vaccines, which they spread all across Africa so that they could try to wipe out the whole continent of Africa. And then the Cold War, biological weapons, how that it would be used, but it was too slow. And it was not killing people off fast enough. And the early targeting was minorities in America. They discussed the African foreign policy and the formation of control over the population there by the United Nations. It discussed in that book Henry Kissinger's New World Order and how AIDS fits into it. How that there was to be a quiet coup in American intelligence, and they would use AIDS. And how the CIA at Fort Detrick operation out of Fort Detrick, Maryland, would use AIDS. Then it discussed also Project MK, Naomi. They have various secret organizations and secret projects for mind control, allowing various types of diseases to go out into the population, viruses, to reduce the population. Then it discussed the CIA's human experiments of AIDS and the man-made origin of Ebola and others. There's much, much more. Then there is the book, Born in Blood, The Lost Secrets of Freemasonry. This particular book discusses the Knights Templar, a secret organization justifying bathing Europe in blood for their religious beliefs. Freemasons, its history, and their blood oaths. The symbols to cover the real beliefs of Freemasonry. And the monks and the Protestants that were in Freemasonry during the Middle Ages, right on down to the current time. And then it discusses the unfinished Temple of Solomon and how they're going to finish that temple in Jerusalem when they have their New World Order. Then there's the book, The Conspiracy, where it discusses the ancient mysteries, the Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians connection, the American dream of using America to establish the one world government, the New World Order. Then it discusses their rise of German nationalism and the causing it, and how the Bolshevik Revolution was at work within secret societies, and they finally achieved it in 1917. It discusses their work, these secret societies and Nazism and the occult, and how all of Germany was involved in the occult, especially Adolf Hitler. And then it talked about in there the secrets of the Vatican, the occult in modern politics today, and how that many of our presidents will do nothing. Check with an astrologer first to see the movement of the stars and what houses and so on the stars and the moon and the sun is in. And then there's a book written, Lost Rights, The Destruction of American Liberty. And it's all of these secret organizations that are performing it. It talks about the war on property rights in America so that we will become socialistic and communistic. It discusses subsidies to farmers and other businesses and how that when they receive them, all of a sudden they become subsidies of the state. And the state tells them what to do, how to control their business. It talks about the opportunity police, how that by the funding of the federal government police departments, and they receive these funds, now they're all driving the same kind of automobiles. The federal government has now created a federal police, which is illegal according to the Constitution. It discusses guns and gun control, drugs, why drugs were introduced in America during the Vietnam era, searches and seizures without warrants, and entrapment of innocent people. They call them snares. It discusses taxing of the American people and then tyrannizing the American people. It discusses bankrupting competitive newspapers and jamming radio broadcasts so that these broadcast stations can be bought out cheaply and newspapers can be bought out cheaply by those who want to control the media in America. Then there is a book called Why Not Freedom? America's Revolt Against Big Government, and it discusses the parties, Republican, Democrat in conflict. How the federal government is having a war against the middle class in America because it must be destroyed. In socialism, communism, there is no middle class. It's the rulers and then the bourgeoisie, the workers. That's all. They're called slaves in modern terms. It discusses the liberal establishment and their national political parties, and how that even though they say they are different, they are all one party. And how their all-powerful, intrusive federal government is taking over and stripping us of all of our freedoms. All this can only happen because we have turned our back upon our God. If we had not turned our back upon our God as a nation, not every individual, but as a whole, this wouldn't be happening. But that book talked about forced racial quotas in America, how that it is an affront, and how that those who are the minorities in America don't like it anymore, or most of them don't like it any more than the white population, the majority. It discusses gun control, the purpose for it, to disarm America so that they can't stand up against a dictatorship with all the military in the hands of them. It talked about forced busing, why crime is in the streets today. It talked about the trillions of dollars of federal debt and why we owe that. Why we just tax the people and spend and spend and spend so that it will keep us in debt to the international bankers so that we can never get out of debt and they'll control us completely and totally. Then it discussed the unfunded federal mandates. They demand that the states institute certain programs, but they don't supply the money to institute them, so the state has to pay for it. The whole idea was to bankrupt the states. Therefore, we would be dependent totally upon the federal government in Washington, D.C., and when the time was right, they would declare the dictatorship. That particular book talked about the anti-middle class programs. The middle class has to be destroyed. In socialism, communism, there is no middle class. That's why the attack is upon the middle class. It discusses attacks on family values, better known as Christian values, because that's where we get our family values, from the Bible. It talks about the federal government assault on freedom of speech. That's why I led out with a newspaper article from Fort Smith, Arkansas, showing that they are now to the point of saying anybody that disagrees with George Bush and Attorney General John Ashcroft is committing treason. The assault upon freedom of speech if we don't agree with their policies. They must silence anyone that doesn't agree. It discussed the attacks on private property, the Supreme Court decisions that is taking Christianity out of America today. And it discussed political correctness, how that if you're not on the correct side, you will be destroyed politically. And the last book I'm going to mention today is The New World Order, the ancient plan of secret societies. This particular book discusses the October 1973 President Nixon's attempted coup d'etat. He was trying to step out of bounds and get out from under the program of his controllers, so they brought him down. It also discusses secret societies and how they've dreamed of a one-world government all the way back as far as the halls of the pharaohs in Egypt. They even call themselves the Great White Brotherhood. They called them Brother Illuminatus, all the way back there. It's Satan's program. He's always wanted it. Then it discusses the great Atlantean plan of connecting Europe with the United States and an all-powerful world government. In this book, The New World Order, it talks about early America and our revolution and how that our Constitution guaranteed that we would not go into a New World Order and have entangling alliances with these people that were promoting them. But little by little, the opposition gained control. It discussed Adam Weishaupt's Illuminati, the French Revolution, then the American Jacobins, or socialists that came into this country in secret to begin to undermine our Christian heritage. It discussed American Freemasonry and how that the North and South split, not North and South for the Civil War, but Freemasonry, and had the northern jurisdiction and the southern jurisdiction, all because each one of them wanted to control the continent when they took over. Then it discussed Albert Pike, Giuseppe Mazzini, and the Italian Revolution. And then Karl Marx and the International that brought the word communism out into the public view, even though it had been on the books since 1829, when Francis Wright came over from England to New York and told all the Illuminati agents in this country in a meeting that they were going to use the word communism. And they would use it as a destructive tool for the rest of the world to bring it into their world government. It discussed the Soviet Revolution, central banking, the Federal Reserve System, and how the Council on Foreign Relations is mixed up in all of this, and how 32nd degree Freemason Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, brought in the Council on Foreign Relations to advise the government of the United States in the 1930s. They've been there ever since. It discussed World War II and the communist aftermath, how they control so much of Eastern Europe. And then finally, it discussed the assault upon the Constitution of the United States. Brethren, I've given you sort of an overview from many books as that there are evidences out there written by totally different authors, different people investigating to see what is happening in the world, why our great country has gone down in morals and religious structure. Our constitutional freedoms are gone nearly. The 10th Amendment giving states rights, it's gone. What happened? There is a conspiracy. But what you have to realize is that the great conspirator is Satan, the devil. Human beings, their names are of no importance. They are the ones who are tools in the hands of the unseen spirit world, Satan and his demons that rebelled against God. They're still rebelling to this moment in time. So what should you and I as individuals do about this? We are not a part of this world anymore. We've been called out to be a part of the church of the living God, which Jesus Christ is the head of. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 2 through 8, I'm going to read this in more modern language, and this is what I'll close my message with. This is what you and I should be doing today, very diligently. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but have not love, I'm nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It's not jealous. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. None of us who have sinned just one time in our life has a right to keep a list of sins that someone else has done and committed. None of us have that right to do that. If Jesus forgave us of our sins, it just may be that Jesus has forgiven the other person of his or her sins. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It's wonderful to know the things that are about to happen on the world scene, but it should only be so that we could get our lives right with God. So that all these character traits that I've been reading right from the Bible will be in each one of our lives. It said love also protects, always trusts, always hopes, always persevere. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they'll cease. Where there's tongues or speaking in foreign languages you've never learned, they'll be stilled. Where there is knowledge, yes, even that great knowledge will pass away. But the one thing that God wants in each and every one of us is a character that will never pass away, based upon God the Father and Jesus Christ. While prophecy is a wonderful thing to know, if you and I do not have our lives based upon the character traits of Jesus Christ, it will do us no good. So I petition you, never forget the goal for which you've been called, to become like God our Father and Jesus Christ.
Well, hello again, brethren. Thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone enjoyed the message today titled, Proving World Government is Planned. So those of you who are joining us, or who've been joining us for the past couple of years already know, that the blockchain system is in reality the beast system. The blockchain system is basically a ledger system where all of the information is from every transaction, and the initial building of the blockchain system was formed by utilizing man's greed. Now in the blockchain there are multiple duplicates of every piece of data. Therefore, if one or more pieces of the data becomes corrupt, it does not affect all of the other duplicates of the data. So a system was created known as mining that will verify the validity of the data being input into the blockchain. In order to do that, you need to have high-powered computers. And they take a lot of energy to run, which costs a lot of money. Running a bunch of high-powered computers also generates a lot of heat, which will eventually burn out the computers, so you need to keep them cool. So now you factor in air conditioning, and that of course is also going to cost you a lot of money. And now this becomes a very costly operation. So what they did was to feed the greed of man. They started with the gaming industry. They allowed them to run a program on their computers, and since the gamers usually had high-end graphics cards, which were ideal for running these algorithms to verify the validity of transactions. So now you have tens of thousands of gamers using their computers and their electricity to run these programs, which is eliminating the need for the large warehouses and hundreds or even thousands of computers and the cost incurred to run them and keep them cool. In return for the gamers, called miners, to run the algorithms and verify the validity of transactions, this is known as proof of work. You'll hear that quite a bit in many of the other topics. Now, when a miner is able to validate a transaction for showing proof of work, they are rewarded with cryptocurrency. And this is it was a huge fad for a while, but today we have only a few of the more serious miners who have built up their business to a point where they have large warehouses. Now, one of the warehouses that they have, or when they do have these large warehouses, they're referred to as mining farms, where they have hundreds, if not thousands, of computers, and they're able to validate millions of transactions, which of course is forcing the individuals in their homes that were a big fad in the beginning to not be able to make enough money to do this anymore. And therefore, these people who have thousands of computers in these warehouses, these mining farms, they generate millions of dollars. Now, there's at least one warehouse that I'm aware of that is in the Arctic, and it's a huge warehouse with thousands of computers, and they route the outside air through the building, of course, removing any moisture in the air. But the freezing temperatures of the Arctic drastically reduce the cost of the air conditioning to cool the computers. Now, one thing that all of the scientists in the world and all of the high-tech geniuses in the world have not been able to do or to duplicate is the human brain that God made. The fastest man-made computers, even at the quantum level, are nowhere near as fast as the human brain. A man has not mastered the use of the human brain to be able to sort, store, and search information as well as a quantum computer, or even the standard computers actually. But the human brain functions by sending electrical currents, and they are extremely low electrical currents, but they also generate extremely low amounts of heat. And man has not been able to duplicate that. And we'll get back to this in a moment. So if you were with us a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the mark of the beast being an invisible mark, which is invisible to the human eye anyways, and how researchers at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, have developed a microneedle patch containing a nanocrystal dye that creates near-infrared emitting nanodots under the skin. The emitted light is then detected by a specially modified smartphone. And here we now have the microneedle patch described by professionals. It is a snake fang-inspired stamping patch for transdermal delivery of liquid formulations. Now, a snake fang, the snake fang they're referring to is that of a pit viper, and the needles on the patch are made from a sugar polymer substance which melts harmlessly into the skin. Also, it's releasing the payload, in this case the vaccine and the nanocrystal dye. Now, for years, everyone has been talking about a grain of rice-sized chip being injected into the body, and this, of course, was supposed to be the mark of the beast. And it did seem so that at one time that's what it could be. But the one thing that I couldn't figure out was how they were going to inject these things into 7.8 billion people around the world. It was logistically impossible. But with this microneedle patch, which is an array of needles embedded in a Band-Aid-like device that is placed on the skin, I can now see that it is indeed possible for this type of mark. This patch does not require any skilled nurse or technician to be present to administer it. Now, also, traditional vaccines require refrigerations, which creates problems in remote locations because loss of refrigeration anywhere along the line would destroy the vaccine. But vaccines delivered with these microneedles don't need to be refrigerated. so they can be sent anywhere in the world via the postal system, Amazon, UPS, FedEx, any of these delivery systems. So the whole family can get their vaccinations sent directly to their homes, and they can also sit around the table, young and old, and administer this vaccine to themselves. Now, Satan can't get the masses of the world to take the mark of the beast. The majority of the people, of course, would refuse and rebel. But what Satan can do is get the masses of the world to demand the mark of the beast. All Satan has to do is create a problem, like a virus, whether it's real or imagined, and then place the world on house arrest to the point where they have cabin fever. They force the people to demand a solution. So they develop a vaccine, as well as develop a method to determine who's been vaccinated and who has not, so that you can recognize the non-vaccinated people that you're supposed to fear. So enter the invisible medical tattoo. Now, these near-infrared emitting nanodots are nanodiamonds. These are man-made diamonds at the nanoscale, and they have what are referred to as nitrogen vacancy voids. Actually, just picture an ice cube that has air bubbles in it. Well, a nitrogen vacancy void is basically air pockets in these C60 carbon diamonds. And by the way, C60 carbon is a major component of the human body, so it will not be rejected. And in these nitrogen vacancy voids, that's where they are able to store the ones and zeros. And of course, ones and zeros are the language that is understood by computers. And they will be used to send and receive information. They are, in essence, biosensors. And on that note, I would like to introduce a patent I found. The international publication date of this patent was March 26th, 2020, and the application, or the applicant of this patent, is Microsoft Technology Licensing, LLC. The title of the patent is Cryptocurrency System Using Body Activity Data. The international publication number is WO space 2020/060606 space A1, which means the patent number is 060606. Interesting number. So, I'm going to read the abstract from this patent and then another section or two. And I encourage you to research this patent on your own and read it in its entirety. So here's the abstract. Human body activity associated with the task provided to a user may be used in the mining process of a cryptocurrency system. A server may provide a task to a device of the user which is communicatively coupled to the server. A sensor communicatively coupled to or comprised in the device of the user may sense body activity of the user. Body activity data may be generated based on the sensed body activity of the user. The cryptocurrency system communicatively coupled to the device user may verify if the body activity data satisfies one or more conditions set by the cryptocurrency system and reward cryptocurrency to the user whose body activity data is verified. Now we'll read a little bit of the background. A virtual currency, also known as digital currency, is a medium of exchange implemented through the internet, generally not tied to a specific government-backed flat printed currency, such as the US dollar or the euro, and typically designed to allow instantaneous transactions and borderless transfer of ownership. Basically what it is saying is you purchase cryptocurrency with US dollars and you travel over to Europe, the cryptocurrencies that you spend over there will automatically be converted to the equivalence of the euro. You no longer have to go exchange your US dollars for euros. The digital cryptocurrency will do all that automatically. All right, blockchain is a data structure to store the list of transactions and get them to be thought of as a distributed electronic ledger. The records transactions between source identifiers and destination identifiers. So you can think of the source identifier as maybe the company for which you work, and the destination identifier would be you. So the source identifier would create a transaction to pay the destination identifier, you, your paycheck. The transactions are bundled into blocks, and every block, except for the first block, refer back to or is linked to a prior block in the blockchain. Computer resources, or nodes, maintain the blockchain cryptographically, validate each new block, and the transactions contained in the corresponding block. This validation process includes computationally solving a difficult problem that is also easy to verify and is sometimes called a proof of work. The process is referred to as mining. The mining may be a random process with low probability, so that a lot of trial and error is required to solve a computationally difficult problem. Accordingly, the mining may require enormous amounts of computational energy. And we went over that earlier, where the computers require electricity and air conditioning to keep the computers cool, and that also requires electricity. So now I'll read the summary of this patent. Some explanatory embodiments of the present disclosure may use human body activity associated with the task provided by a user as a solution to mining challenges in cryptocurrency system. For example, a brainwave or body heat emitted from the user when the user performs the task provided by an information or service provider, such as viewing an advertisement or using certain internet services that can be used in the mining process instead of massive computation work required by some conventional cryptocurrency systems. And they're referring to computers. Data generated based on the body activity of the user can be proof of work, and therefore a user can solve a convocation with some difficult problem unconsciously. Accordingly, certain exemplary embodiments of the present disclosure may reduce computational energy for the mining process, as well as making the mining process faster. So what they're saying here is that instead of using computers for mining, which generate massive amounts of computational energy, which require large amounts of money, with these biosensors contained within these near-infrared emitting nanodots, the human body can be used as the mining farm, essentially eliminating the exorbitant cost. So when we look at the beast system mentioned in Revelation 13 and 14, we see that it has to be a global system, and we have that today with the blockchain. The beast system is a system of control, and it is going to control mankind. In Revelation 13, verse 17, it states that no man will be able to buy or sell unless they have the mark of the beast. They're going to market this invisible medical tattoo they're not going to market it to necessitate buying and selling. They're going to market it as having the ability to move around normally. And if you want to get out of quarantine or house arrest, whatever you want to call it, and function normally, like go to work, go to the beach, visit a friend, go to the store, etc., all you have to do is get this invisible medical tattoo vaccine, and you can leave your house. And as an added bonus, if you watch these advertisements and perform these tasks, we'll reward you with cryptocurrency. And it can all be done unconsciously. So people are going to eat that up. They're going to be going, really? That's all I have to do? And I can get out of this quarantine and get my life back to normal? Well, sign me up. They're going to walk right into it, and they're going to demand it. Now, this isn't going to take place right now during this round of the virus, but we could start seeing it by this time, by the time winter starts this year, which is when they are predicting and preparing for the second wave of this virus. But it will not be mandatory at that time because the mandatory declaration has not happened until the last 3.5 years. And we're also still looking for things that have not transpired yet. We still need to have the introduction of the false prophet, the Antichrist, and animal sacrifices. So God is showing us right now how Satan is building his system and implementing his mark, and he tells us to watch so that we are not side-blinded. And brethren, at this point I'd like to mention that Brenda Smith would like to extend her gratitude for everyone's continued support as demonstrated through your tithes, offerings, donations, and prayers. And remember that your support is always a tremendous help. And if you found these messages have been a blessing to you, we would like to ask in return if you could also be a blessing to us. Whatever the good Lord moves you to give and your finances will allow is always greatly appreciated and will always be used to continue to get God's word out to all those who have an ear to hear. And you can send your tithes, donations, and offerings to Post Office Box 36, Waxahachie, Texas, 75168. Brethren, remember that I'm not telling you this to induce fear. I'm telling you this so that we know, so that we can understand and watch it evolve and not fall victim to Satan's trickery and deceit. Because in Genesis 3 verse 1, we were told that Satan is more subtle than any beast in the field. And in Matthew 24:24, we're told that he's going to create great signs and wonders, and they're going to be so spectacular and convincing, insomuch that if it were possible, they should deceive the very elect. Brethren, we need to make sure that we are not deceived. Until we meet again, do not accept the mark of the beast, and let's make all our days worthy of God's blessings. May you all have a blessed week, and goodbye for now.